expressed, we will be here again. But I simply say this to those naysayers around the world. We, many of us in this field today, in this park today, have been on many demonstrations in support of the Palestinian people over many years. And we will be here as long as it takes. We will never give up on the Palestinian people. We will never go away from the Palestinian people and their cause.
Welcome everybody to this week's Patreon exclusive episode of Left Reckoning. I'm David Griscom. Matt Leck is lost somewhere in the wilds of online. I was not able to find him. But I'm very happy to be joined today by friends and comrades and members of the Frightful Hobgoblins collective, Jaice, Sara, Titus, and Jonny Jones, both from the UK, to talk a little bit about Palestine, the struggle for freedom, and also this political moment that we're all experiencing. And I'll set that up a little bit in a second, but before we get too far, how are y'all doing?
Hi.
Very good, thanks.
It's good to see you on. I'm really happy you're able to join us, for your premiere on Left Reckoning, hopefully the first of many. But let's set the stage a little bit because, I had pitched this, I think a week and a half ago to Jaice to come on to talk about what's happening politically in the US and the UK, sort of trying to tease out the difference between both like the political calculus and also what's going on socially, because I've been saying to a lot of folks that I've never seen this much momentum or at least openness in the general public when it comes to Israel-Palestine. It doesn't mean the political solutions are necessarily right in front of us right now, but it is an interesting moment. But with the United States and the United Kingdom's special role in, Israel's apartheid system, I thought it would be interesting to sort of see, how much these things are lining up in these two countries and where the differences are. But just to catch people up, there has been, a ceasefire. And while we can be happy that planes are no longer dropping bombs, it's far from enough. The evictions, the settlements, and the occupations are still in place. And just this past weekend, Israel has been arresting Palestinian Israeli citizens at an alarming rate, just showing that things are far from going back to normal, and what was normal is not acceptable in the first place. So again, we can be happy to see the end of that kind of overt destruction, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. Well, but, while all of this has been happening, there have been really incredible, outpourings of support for Palestinian people across the United States and the United Kingdom, including this past weekend in London, right, where y'all had somewhere around 200,000 folks out marching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the protest on Saturday and the protest the week before were really huge. The first mass protests we've had over Palestine in Britain since 2014, since the sort of Operation Protective Edge, aka the last onslaught on Gaza, and these were really quite significant because obviously happening in the context of COVID, and happening in the wake of the real serious demobilization of Palestinian struggle over the last 7 years, partly brought about because of the onslaught against Corbyn in the Labour Party. So these protests were really a major step in terms of reasserting the centrality of pro-Palestinian politics to the left in Britain, but also more generally the roots that this kind of solidarity with Palestine has in British civil society.
And I just I'm going to put this up real quick, just to give people a sense of the scale. What we were seeing in London, was this Whitehall, is pretty incredible. So this is about 10 seconds, but. And as Jonny was saying, I mean, this is incredible, not just, and this would be incredible at any time, but, in the crisis of COVID. And I feel like y'all are sort of at a different place with that than the United States is in a lot of ways too. But, it's been really exciting to see. And then let me see if I have it here. But you've been seeing similar rallies all across the United States as well. We've obviously focused a lot on what's happening in Los Angeles and New York, but this is Dallas, Texas, just over the weekend, and that's a really beautiful thing to see. There's an incredible social mobilization that's happening, and in the UK case, where do you think that this shift has sort of come from? Do you think it has to do with so much more availability of information, the kind of memories of what happened to Corbyn very recently? Where would you sort of chalk that up?
Yeah, so I think it's to do with just the after effects of BLM and the uprising since BLM. I don't know if you've heard about the Kill the Bill protests that's been happening in the last few months, and it's to do with the police and crime bill, but it was also linked to a case where a police officer allegedly killed a young woman, and protesters had turned up to Clapham Common, and loads of police ended up actually attacking the women. So there was a lot of uproar, and so then a lot of activists came together to organize this Kill the Bill protest. And so, there's been these kind of really radicalizing social movements that have been happening. And I think people are just kind of fed up with sort of, reformism and sort of statism. And I think people are just angry and they're just trying to build things. And I think Palestine is definitely linked to that. And I think just seeing not just the scale, because you can't really have a proper national demo because of COVID, and you can't just put people in coaches and come over. But there's been loads of little demos happening all over the country, which is part of the BLM effect as well, because that's what BLM, people during the BLM, they were protesting little towns, nobody even thinks they would have protests. So it's been pretty amazing. And the same kids who, school kids who are protesting for BLM are now protesting for Palestine. And there's a school locally, and the kids are getting in trouble for protesting for Palestine. And the teacher, there's a video of the teacher saying, "Oh, these kids are all anti-Semites." It's actually wild.
I'm going to be very curious to hear how that's sort of developing in the UK, because obviously the smear of anti-Semitism, which was put against Jeremy Corbyn, had a very, very real effect in y'all's recent politics. Obviously, it's very, very present in the United States, how they were trying to do it to Bernie Sanders, which is amazing. But I don't know if because I'm not in the UK, so I don't know exactly what the on the ground conversations or feelings are with this. I feel in the US, and maybe it's just because there has been such a strong media blackout over covering Palestine for so long, particularly of members of the Democratic Party, traditional liberals, that they just don't have the ability anymore to be as it's so clear what's happening to people in Gaza and the West Bank. It's so clear what's happening in East Jerusalem. Then it's really hard to label anybody who's speaking out against these kind of murders as an anti-Semite. It's still happening. And the right is, really leaning into it. But a lot of prominent, even Zionist, pro-Israel writers in the United States have sort of taken a step back, and really in their void has been the strongest, more right-wing rabid folks. And in a little bit, we'll talk about how the apparatus here is still very strong at silencing journalists. But I will say, this has been an incredible shift. John Oliver, who's not somebody who's particularly good in a commentator of American politics, spoke very clearly about it. Mehdi Hassan, Trevor Noah in the United States, who in his fashion, did one of these kind of wishy-washy apologetics things. But even he was saying that it's an asymmetric conflict right now. So I think that the effectiveness of like the anti-Semitic, like conflating being opposed to Israeli apartheid with like anti-Semitism is starting to weaken in the United States, though it's still very notable. Is that the same kind of feeling that's happening in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the issues that we had during the anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party was the defensiveness and the reticence amongst quite a lot of people in both around the leadership and in the wider Labour left to really go on the front foot and to say, not to say that there was no anti-Semitism. Of course, there's, there are fringes of anti-Semitism that ought to be confronted, but to actually go on the front foot and to say we will deal with, we can deal with this, whilst also absolutely defending the right of Palestinians to resist, our right to offer solidarity to them. And part of the reason for that, I think, part of the weakness of that is that there was a kind of massive defensiveness. There was a sense in the Labour Party and amongst that layer, like, look, if we really want to help the Palestinians, we need to make sure that Jeremy is safe and that Jeremy becomes leader because he cares about Palestine and he can do things. And, that's part of the general logic of reformism, right? And that pressure that it puts on you. And of course, the difference now is that when people turn around and say, try to say, oh, it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. And people are saying, but no one is criticizing anybody for being Jewish. Nobody is criticizing anybody on the basis of religion or ethnicity. People are criticizing the state of Israel. And really interestingly as well, the clear, the videotapes, the horrifying videotapes, tapes, my goodness, that shows how far... how far back I'm going. These clear videos of settlers of Israeli people coming up with not just the most horrific racism, but also this savage violence, and to turn around and say this is somehow anti-Semitic just rings hollow. And I think that's widespread now across the board in Britain. You have a layer of people, you have a layer of younger people who just simply do not put up with that nonsense. Like when these headmasters were saying it's anti-Semitic to use the Palestinian flag, people pushed back against this and said it's ridiculous. And I think one of the most interesting things, this is, I don't want to try and say that, it's all about celebrities or anything, but it is interesting that, for example, when Leicester City won the FA Cup, which is a big sporting event in Britain, the football, the soccer tournament, when Leicester won, two of the players celebrated by holding up a Palestine flag. This was huge. You just don't tend to see that. And normally that would be punished, or fined or something. That hasn't happened despite calls for that. And then just very interestingly as well, there was some wacky, horrible full-page advert in the New York Times, I think, accusing Bella Hadid and Gigi.
I'm going to pull this up while you're going.
And Dua Lipa of anti-Semitism. And normally when that happens, celebrities back down and say, "Oh well, we didn't want to be too strident in what we're saying. We don't want to lose our contracts or whatnot." And I thought Dua Lipa put out perhaps one of the most unapologetic, responses to that smear. And when you see that, not only can you tell that these people are gaining confidence from the movement, but that it's a sign of the confidence of the movement and its resilience against these kinds of smears. Yeah, exactly. This is just such nonsense.
No, and I think the point you're making is incredible. And for folks who are listening and not watching, this is an ad in the New York Times where Bella, Gigi, and Dua, I hope I'm saying everybody's name correctly, Hamas calls for a second Holocaust, condemn them now. And basically, they're this just horrible slander, that these celebrities here are supporting, calls for another Holocaust and mass genocide. And there's two things that I would note is like, one, what Jonny was saying, which is incredible, is that people aren't stepping back, right? I think Paris Hilton did delete her tweet in support of Palestine, but hell, she did a tweet in support of Palestine. So that was pretty incredible. But for the most part, people are feeling more confident and comfortable standing strong on it because they do have, public support for these things. The second thing, and this is just a side note for our listeners, this is exactly what Matt and I talk about, though, with this really dangerous precedent that has been normalized in the United States. I don't know if it's the same in Britain, of what they call a native advertising, where you can get an advertisement, but they make it seem like it's an official news story, and you can put a bunch of it's propaganda in its fullest sense here. For folks who have seen the image, this is a frightening image that also is trying to make it seem like there is a viable news report behind it, and instead it's just pro-Israel lobby propaganda.
Yeah, and I think it was also really wonderful to be in the protests, with multiracial protests, and particularly with Muslims, who I feel like the community has been quite resilient with all these attacks, and quite over the last few years. I think I went to a Palestine demo in 2018, and it was tiny. And I don't know if you've heard of this kind of operation called Prevent, which creates suspects and targets Muslim communities in schools and universities, and so people have been kind of targeted by the state. And this, I think, just being around the communities, and it was just wonderful. There were so many people. It was great.
I've never seen this much public support in the United States. I remember, when I was in college joining Students for Justice in Palestine, something which we should note, they just fired an AP reporter about. So the effectiveness of the firewall around telling the truth about Palestine is still very strong. And it's one of those things is we're not doing this to say we're sitting on the, the victory, on the, in the end zone saying we just won the game. We're sitting here saying okay, there's movement and it's exciting. But when I was in SJP, I was very worried. In the sense of I might be sacrificing, a career, right? And just feeling like there has been a shift in the way that these things are talked about, where you don't have to be secret. These were secret convictions for the most part of a lot of lefties in the U.S. That they would, from time to time show up at a march or rally, but it'd be a small group of people. Everybody knew each other, versus these where it's a very, very different feel from what I've been seeing. And, it's happening here in Texas right now, which has been really, really beautiful that there has been this kind of shift. And I wanted to share, before we talk a little bit about the political scene, because it is rough, that there is some good news too on this front as well. I don't know if, and I'm sure they're doing the same thing in the United Kingdom, these kind of anti-BDS laws. But Georgia, the state of Georgia, has an anti-BDS law, and Abby Martin, who's an incredible anti-imperialist journalist here, whose movie Gaza Fights for Freedom, people should definitely be checking out, even though YouTube, and we'll get to that in a second, is trying to prevent people from watching that right now. They won their case. So this is her statement. So basically, she was sort of pushed to not be able to present at a panel because of this anti-BDS law, this anti-free speech law, essentially, in Georgia. And they challenged it in the U.S. courts, and they just won today. And this is their statement. I'm thrilled at the judge's decision to strike down this law that so clearly violates the free speech of myself and so many others in Georgia. My First Amendment rights were restricted on behalf of a foreign government, which flies in the face of the principles of freedom and democracy. The government of Israel has pushed state legislatures to enact these laws only because they know that sympathy and support for the population they brutalize, occupy, ethnically cleanse, and subject to apartheid is finally growing in popular consciousness. They want to hold back the tide of justice by preemptively restricting the right of American citizens to peacefully take a stand against their crimes. As the world watches Israeli aggression continue in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and against the population it besieges in Gaza, it has never been more urgent to advance the BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against the Israeli regime. The striking of this law is a necessary and timely opening to build this urgent task.
Absolutely.
That's a great result. And two things that come to mind in that is, one is of course, Israel is very, very keen for governments that are sympathetic to it to step in and intervene. against BDS and to block BDS. But I don't think we should imagine that it requires the Israeli state lobbying to do these things. The British and American governments are more than happy to push these things because it serves their own purposes as well. And here in Britain, I mean, this is precisely what's happening. So that law that you're talking about there is being introduced on a nationwide scale by the current Tory government, and it's part of an entire approach towards politics that the Tories are pushing, which is, really we have very little in the way of political coherence and consistency. But what we can do, and what they're trying to do, is to use, I don't always like the term, but sometimes it can be quite useful. But they have, this culture war approach, and they think that by drumming up divisions based on what they see as cultural issues, that they can shore up support. And so they're bringing in a law, or they're going to try and bring in a law that will make it illegal for local authorities, so for local government and for anything in the public sector to have a BDS policy. And they're going to push forward on this, and I think they're going to hopefully encounter quite a lot of resistance. And I think that this really speaks to what the tasks of the left are going forward. I think because one of the things that in Britain, the history of Palestine protest is somewhat different. Certainly since 2001, we had a very strong anti-imperialist influenced anti-war movement that put Palestine solidarity at its heart. And so Palestine solidarity has been a really major part of the British left landscape for a long time. And so going forward, what our challenge is how do you make this not just something that is solidarity and support that explodes, when there's a big attack and then declines, but how do you institutionalize it? How do you carry it forward? And I think BDS is, now is the time for BDS in our trade unions, especially in our trade unions, but in our communities, in social movements. Can we, for example, make alliances with local government unions, public sector unions to oppose this law? Can we link that fight against this law to the fight against the policing and crime bill? Can we start to create a front within a British society, rooted in the British working class and in working class institutions, that is fighting back against the attempts of the state to criminalize resistance, to criminalize opposition to Israeli apartheid? And I'm really optimistic that there is an opening for that now. But again, crucially, it depends on what we do. And crucially, it depends on whether you're in the Labour Party or outside the Labour Party. I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I was briefly a few years ago, but left at some point over the last year. Can these forces come together and start to carve out spaces of doing politics, opening up spaces for political organizing that can really build coalitions in civil society? You can bring on board trade unions, you can bring on board charities, you can bring on board community groups, all sorts of forces that can resist these attempts to criminalize protest and to criminalize resistance to Israeli apartheid. And by doing that, you can start to create the sort of infrastructures that you need to have, ongoing organizing, a longevity of organizing. And now, as you're saying, now just seems like the moment where there are real possibilities for that.
Yeah, and I would add that the point you were making too is it's not just that the Israeli government is lobbying US and UK officials to do this kind of stuff. We've been trying to make that point, especially in the US, because there is a lot of focus on organizations like AIPAC, which donates a lot of money to politicians' campaigns. But people need to understand, the United States supports Israel because Israel is of incredible value for United States foreign policy in the area. This is not just one of those things where it's oh no, money, money in politics corrupted the well-meaning American imperialist state. This was very much a project in a lot of ways too of American foreign policy. But on this point about BDS, I want to ask y'all, sort of as we're talking about, okay, here's the opening that's going on socially in our political movements. I'll just paint the picture within the main parties in the United States. We are seeing some shift, right? Again, it's not enough. Among people who identify as Democrats in the United States, there has been a huge shift in opposition to Israeli apartheid. I don't think they use this kind of terminology in the survey, but in March, 53% of people who identify as Democrats think that the Democratic Party needed to start putting more pressure on Israel. That was a 10% increase from just 3 years ago, right? So there has just been a kind of like organic movement against what Israel is doing before even this most recent example of the atrocities there. And within the Democratic Party, obviously people talk about, the squad. It's very good that AOC, Ilhan, Rashida, and Bernie have been fighting to stop this additional sale of $735 million of targeted missiles to Israel. But, one, it's not enough. And two, when we talk about BDS, that's a whole other question. Only Tlaib, Omar, and Cori Bush are good on it. The rest are either silent, or people like Jamal Bowman and Bernie are against it. That's something that needs to be taken as a very serious political question, because one thing that I think a lot of people who are getting into this, especially the way that Americans have learned to sort of do activism in the past couple of years, which is a good thing, using social media and stuff like that. People are very fixated on the donations, right? And donating is really, really important. I'm not saying don't donate, but this is a political problem. It's not a hurricane. It's not a natural disaster. This is something that is coming from politics, and knowing how to influence politicians in the United States, and also building the social movements that can, use BDS to end the system. That's really critical. I'd be curious to hear sort of like, we don't have to spend too long on it, but like, what's the makeup right now within like the Labor Party and even the Tories when it comes to Israel? Is the Labor Party like the Democratic Party in the United States, where the Democratic Party is like the bastion in a lot of ways for Israel, pro-Israeli policy in the United States, because there are so many people who are diehard, Zionist, pro-Israel. You can't criticize them at all.
Well, I mean, on that front, in the Labour Party, I mean, the Labour Party membership. Mm-hmm. I think there was a poll that was done relatively recently that actually showed that a majority of Labour Party members support BDS. Amongst the parliamentary Labour Party, so the elected politicians, there's a lot of this, sort of attempt to face in two directions, right? They, you see a lot of people. There's a group called Labour Friends of Israel and Labour Friends of Palestine, and you'd be shocked by how many people are members of both. But absolutely, there is strong support for Israel in the Labour Party. Criticism of Israel, generally speaking, has to be limited, but not just has to be limited, but it is by the politics of a lot of these MPs, to criticisms of the Netanyahu government rather than of the very nature of Israel as a settler colonial state. And this has deep roots. Even, Jeremy Corbyn, who I think, is a terrific politician in a lot of ways, but his position formally is for a two-state solution in Israel. But there are a limited number of people who support a one-state democratic solution, but it's growing. And when it comes to, I mean, more generally, not amongst Labour MPs, but amongst Labour MPs, there are a small number of people who are supportive of BDS, and notably John McDonnell, who again I've got a lot of time for. I think he made a lot of unnecessary concessions while he was the shadow chancellor, but he really came out and put his neck on the line and said now is the time for BDS at the demonstration on Saturday, and good for him. And so I think that there are lots of activists. There are lots of people on the wider Labour left who want to push on BDS. There's a small number of Labour politicians who will back them. But it's possible to push more. And what we've learned, even just in this last year or so, is that what gets the goods in terms of shifting Labour politicians is actual stuff happening outside on the streets in the Labour movement and in protests. What shifted Keir Starmer when it came to BLM or when it came to the crime bill was protest. It wasn't anything that was happening inside the Labour Party. And so, if that's what people want to do is influence politicians, then that's, then this kind of movement building is crucial, much more important than trying to influence getting the right people elected inside the Labour Party, I think, anyway. But more fundamentally than that, I think that, it is good in and of itself for the left for us to build the capacity to act, the capacity to organize, and to mobilize. And so for me, for example, it's great to hear politicians say things like that, but when protesters occupied the Elbit factory, which is an Israeli arms company in Leicestershire last week, and the fire brigade were called and turned out, and the police expected the fire brigade to help them get these protesters off, and the fire brigade said no and put out a statement saying we support the right to protest and we support Palestine solidarity. That kind of action and that kind of movement is as important or more important than what we hear from politicians. The fact that there's the possibility of having all of that together, I think, is a really promising sign.
Yeah, and I think also there were these actions by dock workers in Italy and South Africa where they said that they wouldn't move Israeli weapons and ships, and that was really amazing.
It was beautiful to see.
Yeah.
And something, for people to remember, in the United States is technically illegal under our really draconian labor laws. So remember, all these fights are very, very much connected. I really can't thank both of y'all enough for hanging out with me this afternoon or evening, y'all's time, and talking about this. This is a really important fight, and I think people should recognize that when there is an opportunity, this is no time to sit back and relax, but really time to press forward, because there is an opening right now that I've not seen in my life, and it's exciting to see that it's not just isolated to the United States as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, David.